Okay, so we are in the continuation of Siman 105, and we're starting with Tikvah. So take it away. I see, Tikvah, you sent something out in Google
Yeah,
Drive.
so I just sent sources in, I
I
just
heard,
sent sources in the chat, and I'm gonna open that and share my screen as well. So I'm just gonna open the actual document and not the Google Doc.
okay, tour. Oh, I see you doing a comparative analysis. I like that.
All right. Yeah, so I want to start. Sorry, I want to start by looking at the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch next to each other, and it's essentially the same content, but I think there's some interesting little additions in the Shulchan Aruch that kind of help me guide what I looked into. So does someone want to read? We can just read the Shulchan Aruch because again, the content is essentially the same.
I can read.
Yeah, thank you.
Bameh devarim amurim shenafal letocha tafshil mipnei she'arotev molich plitat hayisor u'me'arvo bechol hatavshil. You want me to translate? Keep going.
Yeah, you could translate.
So with regard to what were these things said from the previous Siman, or actually probably the first Seif, that when it falls directly into the dish, to the cooked food, because the rotev, the sauce, the liquids, brings out the expulsion of the forbidden food and makes it mixed up in the tavshil, in the dish. Aval isur bein cham bein kar shenafal al atzli she'etal ha'esh eino oser ela kedei netila shehu ke'ovei rochav etzba. But a forbidden substance, whether it's hot or it's cold, that falls onto a roasted food that's net by the fire, it only prohibits the amount of netila, which is the thickness of a finger's width.
Okay, so you could just read the next section and then we'll stop there too.
Sure. Lefichach yerech shetzal'o begido o chatichat yisur shetzal'a im chatichat heter v'nogea ze b'zeh sarich lahasir kedei netila saviv hagid v'chen min hachaticha makom shenaga b'chatichat yisur. So therefore, that a thigh that is cooked with its gid still intact, or a piece of forbidden meat that is roasted with a permitted piece, and they're touching each other, you need to remove from them the amount of a nitilah that is around the gid, and also from the place that where it touched the chticha of isur.
Right. Thanks. So far we have a principle, right, that we're told that essentially rotev is like a conductor for tam. That what we're seeing is this distinction between roasting and cooking, and we're told that's the reason why, because the rotev does this job of somehow spreading around the isur, or the like juices of the isur, right? So and when you're roasting, you don't have that. Then we can just do natila. Then we can just cut out the piece itself, and we're not concerned about this tam kind of spreading out through the entire dish. So the first application of this principle is this distinction between cooking and roasting. And then roasting itself is broken down into a couple different cases where we have either something falls on something roasting, and here we see that that's whether the isur that falls on whatever the piece of meat that is roasting is hot or cold. And we also have the case of the gid the gina nasa that's still inside the thigh, and we also have the case of the two pieces of meat next to each other, which is actually the same, right? That like we were saying last week, that next to each other is still natila either way, but right. But those are the three cases. But essentially, it's the same principle that there's nothing carrying. This is how I'm understanding it. There's nothing carrying the tam or carrying the Easter, the juices of the Easter through the dish. So the problematic piece is isolated. And I just want to point out, we're going to get to it later, but I just want to point out this one difference I think is really interesting between the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. In the Torah, you see it says Itzer Cham or Filu Kar. And in the Shulchan Aruch, he says Ben Cham, Ben Kar. And we'll see why, but I think that's just like a very interesting, just a nuance difference. Okay, so if you can continue reading the second half. And we're going to see in the second half, sorry, we're going to see in the second half a second application of the same idea.
וכן אם נפל איסור על חתיכה שבגדרה שהיא חוץ לרוטב ולא ניער הכתרה ולא כיסה אותה אינו אוסר אלא כדי נטילה. And similarly, if the isor falls on the meat, on the piece that is in the pot, but it's outside of the sauce, he didn't stir the pot and he didn't cover it, then it only forbids a netila's worth. Aval im hi birotev l'rashit kula u'l'ri afilu miksata, o afilu kula chutz l'rotev v'nier o kisa hakidera harotev mipapea hatam u'me'arvo v'nitnas b'chulo. But if it was in the rotev, and for Rashi that means entirely in the rotev, or for the Ri it means only partially in the rotev, or if it was completely outside of the rotev and he stirred or he covered the pot, then the rotev sort of bubbles up and causes the tam to bubble up and mixes in, and it enters all of the piece, and then therefore becomes forbidden.
Right. So in this case, I think we're back to talking about cooking. I think this could be roasting as well when there is some case of the important thing is that here you have a pot and there is rotev, there is this liquid there in the piece, and we see the same idea of this principle that if the chaticha is outside of the rotev, it doesn't have, again, this conductor, it doesn't have something spreading the isur throughout the entire dish. And so, and in this case, it doesn't even have something spreading the isur through the chaticha itself. So you can just do natila. And then we have this mechoket of Rashi and the Ri, where Rashi is saying that essentially, if something is like partially in a rotev, it's as if it's not in the rotev. And we can assume this means that the isur fell on the piece that's not in the rotev, the half that's outside. And for the Ri, even if it's partially in the rotev, it's considered as if it's fully in the rotev. And what's interesting here is, so who would you say is the strict one, who is the lenient one between Rashi and the Ri in this case?
Rashi is lenient.
Yeah. So Rashi is the lenient one, right? Because unless the piece is totally in the rotev, you can just do natila. And the Ri is saying if it's partially in the rotev, no. Now you can't just do natila. I think the implication is you have to treat it like batal b'shishim. You have to treat it like this isur is potentially spreading out through this dish. Yeah, so keep that in mind because we're going to see that is not always the case. So the main questions that I had looking at this to begin with, which is where does this idea come from, right? The idea of the rotev being this conductor for tam, and where does this machoket come from between the Ri and Rashi? So there's a couple Gemaras that are relevant. There's two really important Gemaras. It's the Chulin that we've looked at before, and two like both in Chulin, 96b and 108a. So let's start with Chulin. Can someone read the Mishnah and Gemara?
I can read.
Yeah, thank you.
So the Mishnah, Yerech Shnit Bashel Bagid Nashe, Im Yesh Babanoten Tam, Hariza Asura. The Gemara, Amar Shmuel, Lo Shanu El Shnit Bashel Ba, Aval Nitfa Ba, Kolef Ochel, Eb Shmagia Legid. Right, so we see a pretty straightforward like basis for what we got in the Shulchan Aruch and the Torah, that like Dafka, when I'm like cooking something with the sauce, this is the rule that like Benoten Tam, the whole thing is Asur. Whereas when I was roasting it, basically I can go right up to the ghee itself. And I don't think the rest of it essentially has tam. Ini b'ha'amar Rafuna, gedi shetzalu b'chavo, asor le'echol, afilu merosh. But is that the case? Like, don't we have this teaching from Rav Huna that if I like roasted the ghee with its fats, that like I can't even like basically I need a much further radius from the ghee than Shmuel's statement implied. Shani chalev de mipapea. And so the resolution is that that case is different because the chalev with the gedi is like chalev that would like spread throughout the whole thing. And so in that case, we have to be more machmir as opposed to like the ghee in this case where we don't think it's like mipapea.
Right, thanks. Yeah, so what we see here is the distinction between cooking and roasting. We have that, which we see back right in the Shulchan Aruch and the Torah. And what we have is the beginning of a concept of certain things spread out and certain things do not. But we don't actually have rotev here. We have chalev. We have this fat is what's spreading out.
Tikvah?
So, sorry?
Would you say that essentially you needed some sort of agent to spread flavor in the food is what's going on here?
Yeah, it seems to be saying that it's not, you can't take it for granted that tam spreads out in a food.
Can I ask like the question? I'm not that I have an answer for this, but when you with the whole thing with chisa, right? That you cover the pot, right? Mm-hmm. Somehow that allows spread too, right? This is going to be in the Rashi Tosfot. We're going to see it as well. Like, and a question I've always had is like, well, what is it that when you cover it, you know, when you stir it, I understand, right? Then you get the liquid mixed up. But what happens when you cover it that it then spreads the flavor that's similar to it being very fatty or being liquidy?
Yeah, so that's what we're actually like one of the things that it seems that what's happening when you cover it, I think, is more along the lines of the steam of there's like this heat conductor, which like exactly the point I want to get to is that that seems to be more what Rashi is interested in, and then the rotev comes in as a secondary idea, and so then they work together. But I think you're right that they're like slightly different, but same principle of like something has to create movement in this pot and has to spread the Isser around. And so I just brought this Rashi to show like he's explaining as well that like the fat spreads out. So we have that concept, but we don't have the rotev yet as the conductor for that. And this covers half of the cases that we saw, right? It covers the case of the cooking versus roasting. And if we look at Chulin, this piece in Chulin a little bit later on, 108, that's when we get the story of the pot, the chaticha outside, or not touching the other pieces of the meat in this pot, and this idea of stirring and covering, which is a completely different case. So can someone read, Joel, do you want to read this case?
Sure. This is Tibat Chalav here, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah. So now we're not in Chalev, we're in Chalav. That's a very important distinction.
I mean, it could be Chalev too. It's but Tibat Chalav shenafla l'chaticha im yesh ba benoten tam be'ota chaticha asur. Right. This is a very big question. What's asur? But we'll leave that for a second. But you have a little drop of milk. It falls on a piece of meat, and if it has enough to give tam in that piece of meat, it is asur. But if you stir the pot or the contents of the pot, if it has enough to give flavor to the entire pot, then it's asur. Again, and what the pronouns here are important and not so clear necessarily.
Yeah. So this is a Gemara we've looked at before, and it's a complicated one, has a lot of questions. I'm not going to get into all the nuances of it, but what's important for our purposes is how it corresponds and how it is different than the case that we saw. So big difference. What is like the big difference between this case and the case that we saw in the Shulchan Aruch? I'll just like bring you back to the case in the Shulchan Aruch.
I mean, it's not clear where the chaticha sits. That's part of the problem, right? Is it in the rotev? Is it not in the rotev? Is it right? Which is what's gonna the Rishonim are gonna have to take up as to what's going on here.
Yeah. So again, we don't have rotev actually in this Gemara. Rotev is in the Shulchan Aruch, but it's either not here or implied here. The other thing that's really interesting here is here we have the chaticha becomes asur, like the drop of milk that falls on the chaticha. Now this piece of what we're discussing in this case is whether we're discussing still batel b'shishim, and we're discussing whether this drop of milk is going to be measured against the piece that touches itself or whether it's measured against the entire pot, right? But this is not a case of natila. In the case in the Shulchan Aruch, we have natila. So we have a difference. We have a different principle at play, and we also have a different implication then for the machloket between Rashi and the Ri, right? Because if we play that out, so I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but if we play out, right, this concept, right, that for Rashi, if it's partially in the rotev, it's considered not in the rotev. So for Rashi, if it's partially isolated, it's considered fully isolated. So let's just apply that to this case then. In this case, what would happen? In a case of partial, it's partially in the rotev, partially not in the rotev, but we're going to treat it as if it's totally outside the rotev then. So this drop of milk falls on it. How do we measure the milk?
Just against the chaticha.
Yeah, we measure against the whole chaticha. So then it's more like that would be asur. With the Ri, if it's partially in the rotev, you measure it as if it's fully in the rotev. Then how do we measure the drop of milk?
Potentially against the whole dish.
Yeah. Sorry?
Potentially against the whole dish.
Yeah, potentially against all this. So in this case, the Ri ends up being stricter and Rashi ends up being more lenient. So I just want to, again, like looking at Rashi's interpretation of this Gemara, again, we don't have rotev at all. We just have the idea of stirring. And that without stirring, the issue does not spread through the chaticha. The other important piece that Rashi mentions is he does talk about this stirring, and he mentions that the stirring has to happen immediately. That's here in this third Rashi. Hagis b'miyad kodem shekabal chaticha tam. Right, so you have to stir immediately, and that's another thing that we don't have in the Shulchan Aruch. We don't have the idea of stirring immediately, which raises another question of why, and what's the difference in these cases, which we'll get to. So again, we still don't have rotev, and we still don't have exactly the machloket between Ri and Rashi, where that's coming from. The next thing I want to look at was the Tosfot on this piece of Gemara. And here we have him mentioning, this is the first time we have the mention of the rotev, that it's completely outside of the rotev. And he mentions that it's like we said, he sends us back to study Vav. So I want to go back to the Tosfot there, but I just want to show you first this Gemara to have it in context. Okay. So is someone able to read this Tosfot? Yavni? Thanks. And you can start from the underlined section.
משמע קצת, דאין הרוטב מסייע לשאר חתיכות, אם יש בהם לבטל הגיד, אלא הירך לבדו מדלו כאמר, אם יש בהן וברוטב בנותן טעם וכולי. So it seems from this that we can't include the rotev to help the chatichot to mevatel the gid, because the erech itself has to be because it has to be enough to cancel it, because it doesn't say if there is in the chatichot, in them and in the rotev, enough to cancel it, but not in time. Right?
So what Tosfot's picking up on is in the Mishnah. It says Yor shenit basel baged hanase im yesh bo benoten tam harizeh tzorah. And later on in the Mishnah, in the other cases, it mentions the rotev. It mentions measuring the tam with the rotev and with the other pieces in the dish. Here we don't have that. So the question is, what does it mean yesh bo benoten tam? Is that in the thigh only, or in the thigh within this dish that it's being cooked in? And remember, in the Mishnah, we have the case of bashal, like it's not sleep, it's being cooked. So there's this question in the Mishnah's language of what exactly the gid is being measured against. And he's saying, it seems to be implying that you're just looking at the gid against the thigh. So Yavni, if you want to keep going.
From the underlined again?
Yeah, from Haile the contrast.
והי לפירוש הקונטרס, ניחא דפירש פרק כל הבשר, גבי טיפת חלב, כולי דקאמר בגמרא לא שנו אלא שניער וכיסא, אבל לא ניער וכיסא, חתיכה עצמה נעשה נבלה. So it says that in the Rashi, the Rashi in the other case of the tipat chalav makes sense with this, because in that case of the tipat chalav, you're not going to get to include the rest of it except if it has been covered or mixed, and otherwise it's only the chaticha itself, and that becomes nevela. ופירש בקונטרסט דכי ניער הקדרה, מוליכו הטיפה בכל הקדרה ומסייע כל מה שבתוכה לבטל הטיפה. So, and if you do cover it or mix it, then the drop of milk gets mixed in and the whole dish can help to cancel it. וכן כי כיסה הקדרה עולות הרתיחות משולי לפיה ומוליכות הטיפה בכל הקדרה, בכל הקדרה. So they're explaining that if the covering it means that the steam rises and mixes the tastes together. Am I?
Yeah. So that's how
Are we sure he means steam here and not just like the bubbling up from the bottom?
What would be
like this? It's like you cover it, and that's
like
you cover it, it turns more.
Over? Is that what you mean?
Covering it just heats it more, right? It allows the heat, molecules aren't escaping, and the heat gets higher, and it boils more, and then there's a kind of a circulation flow of rotev at that point that's boiling or that's bubbling.
Either way, that might be true, but either way, it would mean that there's motion. I think it's the motion.
Yeah,
right. There,
so,
right.
Yeah, so, that's what I'm just trying to decide if it's the
actually boil.
If it's the gas or the liquid. That's maybe I'm being too technical about it. I don't know, but it's right, especially when it says mishulei lefia, right? It sounds to me like it's coming from even potentially the bottom of this pot up. And so I'm thinking about, if when I try to boil water, it's much easier to boil it if I cover it than if I leave the top off.
Not immediate.
Wouldn't the convection actually be more if it's uncovered because it's cooler at the top relative to the bottom, which is on the fire? But anyway.
Yeah, it could be. That's but boiling's, I believe it is a question of just it getting hotter, not a question of convection.
Right.
So
it's the boiling, not the fair enough.
But it does make it sound like it's happening immediately. Like the minute you cover it, this thing happens. and the boiling would be a delayed, possibly delayed. So that's why I think I guess that's just visually why I imagined it as the steam, because the minute you put the top on, whatever steam is coming up is trapped there, and it is coming from, like, it would look like it's coming from the bottom. Though I'm not sure that's actually scientifically true.
Retichot, I mean, it does imply to me that it's like really hot stuff, right? Boiling stuff.
Boiling.
Right?
Yeah.
I think my question would be though, when do we start considering this boiling stuff, the hot stuff, the condensation? When does that start being considered rotev? Because I know one of the things that we get to later in the siman that I've been preparing is that without rotev, if it's like condensation, for example, you have two pots and there's a meat pot and a milk pot next to each other, touching each other, they're fine as long as there's no rotev. And the condensation on the pot isn't considered rotev. It's not considered a liquid. So within the pot, when does condensation sort of cross that line to be considered rotev, which can oser before when it's, as opposed to just being condensation that doesn't necessarily? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It made more sense in my head when I was thinking it.
I think it's a good question. I think part of it comes from the fact that I don't think Rashi is working with the concept directly of rotev. Like I didn't see it at all directly in Rashi. And this is the concept Rashi has, right? He has the Retichot. He has this idea of the bottom coming up. Like that's all Rashi. Rotev is, from what I saw, it's all in Tosfot and beyond Tosfot. And it's an implication. It's like, well, of course it has to be the Rotev. Like by like almost, we'll see it later, like in the I think it's in the Shach, but it's like, well, obviously if the piece of meat is in the rotev, you're not going to think of it in isolation. So we just kind of extrapolate out from that rotev is this thing doing this work. But I think it is actually, like, it seemed to me like it's two overlapping concepts that yeah, I'm curious. I didn't like fully play this out, so I'm curious how it would work out in later on. But that is yeah, I think how they relate to each other is a very interesting question, because they're like overlapping, but I don't know that they're perfectly in the same, like overlapping it's I'm just not sure that there's an answer to that question, that at least that I know it from this. Which is also why you need the two, you end up needing both of them, right? You need it to be covered and stirred. If it's out of the rotev, like it's the same idea, right? Eventually you need some way of, again, mixing it up and moving it around. But we'll see later, there's also then a question of, well, what if it's in the broth, like what if it's in the rotev, but you don't stir it? And there are some people who say, well, then is this treated in isolation? You do actually need the stirring. So that's, yeah, good question, but I don't have an answer. Right, but this piece that Tosfot is quoting, it comes from this Rashi over here. It's later on in Chulin. So he, like, I just brought that Rashi to show where Tosfot is getting this. So Yavni, if you want to keep going.
משמע שרוצה לומר שאפילו החתיכה שנפלה הטיפה עליה היא מקצתה בתוך הרוטב, היא לא נייר וכיסא, אין מסייע הרוטב לחתיכות אחרות לבטלה, מהרי הכה בשלא נייר וכיסא. Therefore, we can understand that Rashi means that if the piece, if there is a rotev and the piece, but the piece that the drop of chalav fell on is partially outside of the rotev, then the rest of the pot doesn't help to cancel the drop of milk that fell on it, as long as you don't stir or cover it. Yeah. Velari nira.
It's like here we're talking about where it's not stirred or covering. Right. So yeah. So meaning, I think what this is meaning is here, meaning in our Mishnah.
Right. Here in the Mishnah, which is again talking
about the thigh. Which let's do the rest of the Tosfot and then we'll talk about that.
ולרי נראה כשהחתיכה שנפל האיסור עליה היא מקצתה ברוטב, לא בעינן ניר וכיסא, והתם עירי, כשהחתיכה כולה חוץ לרוטב, דאז אין מתפשט אלא בניר וכיסא, והווה מצי למימר, לא שנו אלא בחתיכה מקצתה ברוטב, אלא מילתא דפסיקה לנקת כשניער וכיסא דאז בכל עניין הרוטב מכסה כל החתיכות, אפילו הייתה כולה חתיכה חוץ לרוטב, והכה דקאמר אם יש בה מנותן טעם, היינו על ידי שלא היה בה עם הרוטב 60 לבטל טעם הגיד. So on countering the Rashi, if you according to the Ri, it seems that the piece of meat, that the drop of milk fell on it, part of it is out of the rotev, and therefore according to the Ri, you don't need to mix it or cover it. And there, where the chaticha is all out of the rotev, then it doesn't, because then it doesn't spread out unless you mix it or cover it, according to the Ri. And that's the only case where that would apply, which would then be stringent. Sorry.
So I think what's going on here is he's going to ask this question of, well, then in the Gemara, we don't have this case where it talks about half in, half out of the rotev. So why, like, if that's how the Ri is interpreting, and this is an important category, an important idea for this whole concept, why doesn't the Gemara mention it? And he's going to answer, well, it's like not as clear. It's not, it's not the simple case, or it's not the like in the case where it's totally out, and then we have to have it totally covered. That's the more extreme case. I think that's what he's getting at. But what I found interesting was that he feels the need to explain why this case is not there, right? So again, it's this idea of, well, we're assuming this rotev, and now we're going to see how this fits into the Gemara, even though it's not explicitly there. I have to admit, I had a hard time with the larger message of Tosfot over here, because his answer to the question seems to be that according to Rashi, the Mishnah means that, like, you are just measuring the gid against the thigh, and that this is a case where you're considering the thigh in isolation, but it's a case of chanan. It's not a case like we saw in the Shulchan Aruch of Natila. It's a case where, more like the case in the Gemara of the Tipa al the Chalav, that there's a potential for this gid to make the entire thigh asur, but not the rest of the pot. And that doesn't seem in line with the Shulchan Aruch. So I'm not sure if I'm missing something here, or if these are just, they're treating the cases differently. I'm not sure if that's clear what my problem is.
Can you repeat the Mishnah?
Yeah,
Show us the Mishnah again.
Yeah, let's go back to the Mishnah. So let's go back actually to the Mishnah in Chulin, right, where we have the case of the milk. In the case of the milk, we said it's a case of, what are we concerned about? We're concerned about this milk spreading through the entire chaticha and making it asur. Natila is not an option here. It's a question of whether you're measuring batal b'shishim against the chaticha itself or against the entire pot. And there's what we're gonna see. I think it's in the Beis Yosef, or maybe in the Taz, but that he considers this case is different than the case we have in the Shulchan Aruch. In the case of the Shulchan Aruch, we have a piece of Isser falls on a chaticha that's outside of a rotev, and you do natila on it. So you're not measuring batal b'shishim. The question is not, is this batal b'shishim against the chaticha itself or against the entire pot? It's whether you can just cut out the Isser and that's it. so one of the answers of why are these cases different? I mean, just like logically, like what would be the difference?
Can you show us our Mishnah? Show us the other Mishnah also. I want to compare
Yeah,
them.
here, let's look at them, see if I can get them here. They can be on the same page. Here is this Mishnah about the Yorach and the Gid Hanasa, right? So here we have a case of a Gid Hanasa in a thigh that's being cooked. That's case one. In case two, we have a drop of milk that falls on a chaticha. And the question is whether it's in the rotev, whether it's not in the rotev, how much interaction is it having with the rest of the pot. Now what Tosfot is saying is, why in this case, in case one with the thigh, are we not measuring the gid against the thigh within the rotev, within the entire pot? We're just measuring it against the thigh itself. And because of that, Tosfot is saying, well, maybe it's like this case here, where we also are just measuring the milk against the piece of meat itself. And the implication would be that in this Mishnah, in Mishnah over here about the thigh is partially in the rotev but partially out of it, and therefore for Rashi, that would be a case where you treat it in isolation and you just measure the gid against the thigh.
And for Rabbeinu Tam.
And for the Ri, you would say, for the Ri, he's saying, no, that's not the case. You do measure it against the entire pot, but the Mishnah just doesn't mention it. It just doesn't like say it explicitly, but that is the implication.
Would you just say that those are cases where it's entirely outside the rotev, which is why you just measure it against like the yerech or the chatzah?
Right, that would be the great thing to say.
Yeah,
just say both of them are out of the rotev, and you have no problem. Say there is no rotev.
I think the reason he can't say that, I would say the reason he can't say that, right, is because we then right away in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, have the contrast between the baked and the roasted one. And if you're working with the assumption that the difference is rotev, but the reason the roasted one doesn't, that you can just do natila and you don't have to worry about the bashishim is because there's no rotev. It's the same concept. Then I think you have a problem there, but you have that problem with Rashi as well. Like that problem exists. That's story what I was trying to say before is that problem exists either way. That once we're looking at this case, the Yorach, that the Gid Hanasa, that is, once we're equating it to the case of the milk and the chaticha outside of the rotev, I by the Shulchan Aruch, by like the principle that we saw in the Shulchan Aruch, you should be applying natila. You should not be applying batal b'shishim.
Well, the truth is that the word bishul, it says in this Gemara in Chulin, but in Shmuel, Amar Shmuel lo shanu ela shnit bashel. So bishul itself implies that there's some water there. Otherwise, it's not bishul.
So that's one of the questions. But I think in the implication with the Shulchan Aruch and with the case where you have this chadicha outside the rotev, you're talking about bishul. You're talking about a case where the pot as a whole is being cooked in liquid, and it's described somewhere else where you have what the Ri is describing is a piece of meat that's kind of sticking halfway out of the pot. And what Rashi would imagine is you have a piece of meat halfway outside the pot and another piece of meat resting on top of it. So it's totally outside the rotev. But this is a case of bishul still. It's just bishul outside of the rotev.
In Chulin 96b.
In Chulin 96b and in more importantly in the Shulchan Aruch. The case in the Shulchan Aruch that we're looking at that says
that's clear.
For sure.
That's clear. I'm trying to lock down the Chulin 96b.
Yeah, so I think in 96b as well, it has to be that it's also assuming Tosfot for sure has to be assuming rotev because that's what bishul means. Like that's the distinction he makes between tzli and bishul in this Gemara. Like based on this Gemara, his explanation for why, why it's different in the case of roasting is the rotev. So the condition of the case in the Mishnah has to be that there's rotev there. But then he says, well, maybe it's outside.
So wait, can we say conclusively that the Mishnah here, 96b, according to everybody, really should be a case of liquid? And when it says lo shanu ela b'nit bashel, that's because that in that case it's aser. But if you roasted it, it's kolef. And then if you go to the other Gemara, can you scroll to the other Gemara? the other Gemara, so here it's unclear. Here it's unclear whether the teapot chalav is falling on a chaticha and it's just chaticha, dry chaticha in a pot, or there's rotev. And if it's a rotev, it seems to be problematic. It seems to be contradicting, it says, why does it say about oto haticha? It should be the whole thing.
Right.
So Rashi, so Rashi could say there's no rotev here. And Tosfos says there is a rotev here.
So, but I think in Tosfot here, so this Tosfot is going back to 96b. I think when it's saying here, and again, maybe this is a mistake in the way I'm reading it, but the way I'm reading the question that they're asking is not on the case in 108. They're bringing that case as a proof to explain the Mishnah over here on 96. To explain why the Mishnah only mentions the thigh and the gid, and it doesn't mention the entire pot. Right? The ein harotev mitzay l'shar chatichot im yesh behem lebatel hagid ela hayorach levado medelo ka'amar im yesh behem uberotev v'natan tam. Right? That's his question. Are we looking at the thigh alone? And that's what I'm struggling with, is what is this case? Because this case sounds more like the case from the Shulchan Aruch that require natila, and not like the case with the milk that requires batal b'shishim on the piece alone.
In other words, the continuation of the which you didn't bring is that it talks about it does mention rotev actually, but yet the beginning of the Mishnah doesn't talk about rotev.
So it does, right? It does mention motive, and I just want to be clear with, like, when I keep saying it doesn't mention motive, it does mention motive as how much do you measure in various places. It will talk about, well, do you measure against the rotev or not against the rotev? What I mean is, I didn't see anywhere in the Gemara explicitly the idea that rotev is the conductor that is spreading this tam. But yes, that's exactly the point. It's later in the Mishnah, in later cases in the Mishnah, it will say you measure the tam against the rotev and everything else in the pot. And that's exactly what Tosfos is picking up on. Why in this first case in the Mishnah do we not have that language? Well, is that implying therefore that the thigh is outside of the rotev? And then we have a case where we are looking
where
at
it's similar to the other, where it's similar to the other Gemara in 108, right?
Yes, exactly. Except the which is fine. Like all of that actually works out. Except when you add in the Shulchan Aruch that it would imply that in this case you would do natila and not batal b'shishim. So this Tosfot is completely, it's completely, I keep saying accurate, but it's completely consistent with 108. My question is whether it's consistent with the Shulchan Aruch, and that's I didn't have an answer to that.
Wait, so show me again the contradiction. Why is it contradiction?
So what Tosfot is saying here, right, is the content in the Mishnah is whether the entire thigh becomes asur because of a noten tam, right? And the implication is we're measuring the gid hanasa against the yorach, and we're trying to figure out, right, if there's 60, if the thigh is 60 times bigger than the gid, and if it is not, then the entire thigh is going to become asur. That's
and yet in the Shulchan Aruch it sounds like that case should be just a case of natila.
Yeah, and in the Shulchan Aruch it sounds like that case should be just a case of natila because of the assumption that this thigh is outside the rotev and therefore not measured against the entire pot.
I mean, we can answer that in a lot of, with external information. We can answer that question with external information. We can say that the Shuman Hagid is Asad Rabbanan, and the Shuman is Mifapeya, and therefore the Gid, the whole thigh with its Yerech is obviously with its Yerech with its Gid is also going to be with its Gid, with its Shuman Gid, and it's the Shuman Gid that's going to cause it to be Asad, and the Shuman Gid spreads everywhere, so therefore Natila is not sufficient. So we can answer that. But that's with external information that we didn't yet see.
Right.
Because we also know that Gideon probably don't have any top. So why is this Yerech at all or anywhere?
Right.
Nachum, what's a Jewish term, a Lumdisha term for external information? When you say that, just help me out a little bit.
mean, you might say ukimta.
Ukimta, yeah.
You might say,
That's
but yeah.
going pretty far. Okay. All right. Thank you.
I'm just saying information that's not apparent from this, from what we just from the Mishnah.
But it's interesting. Tosfot doesn't mention that either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, why is it usher? Right. Why is it usher at all? I mean, that's a more basic question.
Right. But besides.
But that's the real. But that's our. That's the elephant in the room, no? That that there is no Tom in the Gid. Why is there an Isur? It doesn't fully answer it. When you go to a Drabanan, that's a save. You're saving the situation. But then you have to say it's only on a Drabanan level. Just your language, Nachum, when you said we can't answer that. It's like, but it's a little. It's not the type of answer we would really like to have. We would like to have.
I'm just saying, us as knowledgeable people, us with all of our knowledge of the Shulchan Aruch and Masechet Chulin, we can explain this Mishnah, but it doesn't seem like in the words. That's what I mean to say.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. I agree. So I like what Tikvah's doing.
Yeah, Tikvah, you're analyzing it very nicely.
I'm not trying to be critical, but would it help at all to say that the Shulchan Aruch is saying even if it is batel, then you still need to leave off the kedei netilah? Or I'm not sure.
I don't think so, because he says ela kedei eino oser ela kedei netilah.
I think also
that,
in
that
general,
could be like assuming that that in a standard yerech the gid is less than 1 in 60. That's my proposition.
That I don't have that external information.
I mean,
that's external information I'm unaware of.
I think usually kedei netilah is paired with asur kula, right? Like it's a kula on isur through the whole thing versus the two pairs that I've always seen together in Isur Eter is hadacha be'alma and kedei and klipa go together, and kedei netilah goes with asur kula. So.
Maybe, I'm saying maybe, but also it's formulaic. Because of what you're saying, is then whenever we say kedei netilah, we say ela kedei netilah. In other words, I'm a little concerned of putting too much weight on the word ela.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It says eino. Right. I mean, whatever. It says eino oser ela kedei netilah. I don't think you can say it's asur kula.
I'm saying it's the kula of, you might have,
Yes.
the havamina would have been, it's us, the whole thing is asur.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's only kedei. That's,
True,
in this case,
true.
we're makil.
Right.
But Yavni, your point is true too, right? Like if it was a case of, if we're looking at this thyroid, it is in Rotev and it is Bata Vashishim, we would still have to cut out the gate. So that would still be true, like in any case. Yeah. But that's not the case here. So I just wanted to show a little bit more, like emphasizing this, I think, where this concept, like the idea of where the rotev and whether it's intuitive, that like, well, of course the rotev is the thing doing this work. Of course the rotev is the thing trying the time or not. So I wanted to move over to Shulchan Aruch 92. So this is the piece on the actual case of the milk dropping on the meat. And I didn't bring very much from here because it is not our focus, and it is gets into a whole other topic mostly. But if you see the Taz, where he says "L'toch keder shel basar zeh me'ir shenafal tifa al chatichat achad chutz l'rotav." So he says we're talking about a case where the milk falls on one chaticha that's outside the rotev. The ibetoch rotev v'dai kol ma shebekeder misarf lebatal hatifa. Right. So if it's in the rotev, for sure, it everything combines. Right. So we're just talking about a case outside. But in the equivalent idea in the Beit Yosef, he does bring the let's see, I'm just trying to skip to the place. here he brings the Gahot Maimon that writes on Rashi, shefilu hayta chaticha betoch harotev shenifla hatipa aleha im lo ni'ar v'kitza ein harotev mesayah lebatal tam hatipa. So he's saying that no, even if it's totally in the rotev, you still need to stir or to cover it, because you have to, like what we were talking about, you have to mix up the stuff that's going, the bottom has to get to the top. There has to be some motion going on. And the rotev is not enough by itself. It's too, just by itself, it's just sitting there. It's not actually spreading the tam around. So I thought that was really interesting, that there is actually an opinion like that. Yeah.
I mean, Tikvah, I think you've done an excellent thing here, because you've shown that perhaps this opinion doesn't really exist. In other words, mitoch perush Rashi, it's like it seems to be according to Rashi. It comes out according to Rashi, but we didn't find any place where Rashi actually says that. Tosfos says he says. Tosfos makes that distinction, right? Am I correct?
No, so I would say the opposite. I would say this seems to be more accurate to what Rashi is saying, because this is closer to what Rashi is actually saying. If we go back to this Rashi here, right?
No, but he doesn't say there. I'm talking about the fact that the piece could be partially. That even if what the Beis Yosef is saying is that even if the piece is partially submerged in the liquid, and the drop falls on the part that's above, according to Rashi, you should stir it so that you can measure against the whole pot, and that you don't just have that one piece becoming usher. But Rashi never talked about rotev.
Right. So I think what he's
So who
saying.
did? Who put these words into Rashi's mouth?
So when he says betoch rotev, I don't even think he means partially. I think he means fully. And it's saying, like, who put the importance of rotev into Rashi's mouth at all, right? Like Rashi, what's important to Rashi is that things get moved around, either through stirring or through covering the pot, and the bottom moves up to the top.
No, I don't think you can say it's totally. I don't think you can say it's totally in the rotev, because then the tipa, the tipa would spread. If there's a centimeter of liquid above the piece, then it spreads. It's only where it falls on the part of the piece that's not submerged.
It could be like maybe a little bit of it has to be outside, but I think it could be more than half, right? Like
Yeah, I just say once it's, in other words, according to Tosfos, once it's partially submerged, it's considered part of the pot, and therefore that's a kula in the sense that you can go against the whole pot. Of course, it's a chumrah also, because if there isn't 60 in the whole pot, then the whole thing is usher. Whereas according to what, right, if there is 60, but whereas according to Rashi, only the piece would be usher.
So just looking, like, keeping to go in the Beis Yosef, he says mashma divav she'afal pi shekula betoch harotev. So I think it is talking about more than even half. I think you're right. Something has to be like touching it, but it is almost entirely in the rotev.
No, rak shepaneha. No, you can't stop there. Shekula betoch harotev rak paneha elyon migule. That's what I call partially submerged. In other words, it's got its surface is above the liquid. It's revealed.
Right.
Well,
and
I mean,
the rest of it is under.
That has to be the case. Otherwise, a tipat chalav couldn't fall on one piece, right?
Exactly.
But it's like just
There's a centimeter of liquid
through. I think, like, right, like it's not half out. It's just like there's something at the top.
Yeah, it doesn't matter whether it's half or a third or the tiny paneha elyon.
Right.
Whatever. Then we start having to deal with the case of the drop interacting with the piece and deciding what's going on there, says Rashi. But Tosfos would say, no, once it's partially in the water, even if it's half out of the water and the drop hits on the half that's out of the water, it's as though it hit in the whole pot. Isn't that correct?
Right. Yeah, but I still think, I guess what my point is what is the important, like what is, again, that conductor? So what is the thing that mixes the tam? And for the Tosfot, it seems like the rotev can do this really independently. Like the rotev can just kind of absorb it and soak it in. And for Rashi, you do need a little bit more than rotev. Like if it's totally submerged, then it's not even a matter of,
right.
Like it's going into the rotev. It's not even a matter of going from the piece to the rotev. But for Rashi, I just think it's the implications that it's more the stirring and the covering and that movement is almost more important.
Yes,
than the
100%, 100%.
Yeah.
I just thought it's interesting you're pointing out that Rashi never really talks about rotev.
Yeah.
So it's like we have to take it on faith that Tosfos is right. That's what Rashi means.
The best I can get from that is just looking at that first Rashi on the Mishnah on Kuf Chet Amud Aleph, right, where Rashi says Tipat chalav shenafla al chaticha betocha kedera, right? He probably just like, the plain meaning of it is that it's a piece of meat within a kedera, but I think the way that Tosfot are reading that is that it is in the kedera, like it's not standing on another piece of meat. I think that's what's going on, but that's the best I can tell.
Yeah, but there's no but according to Rashi, there's no rotev. So even if it could be 1,000 pieces, they're all dry.
Yeah. Oh, that's hard to imagine. When you cook meat, right? There's always juices come out. It's
not if it's salted meat, which they had.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, but that's separate, and they generally would wash off the salt before cooking the meat.
It would soak it sometimes in water for a day to get it even right. But yeah, but I'm just saying, yeah, but that's the whole point that Tikvah is making. We're all the time assuming that there's rotev here because we know when we cook meat that creates rotev, but maybe it doesn't. Actually, the truth is it depends on the temperature. If you cook at a very high flame, meat, it'll evaporate before it has a chance to make a rotev. If you don't have a lid, and if you lower the temperature, then you can get a rotev. So it's not. I think it's a valid point that there's no requirement to understand this as being there's rotev involved at all. Tosfos seems to understand it that there is.
Right. So I think I did have. I think that is sort of ending that piece. So the one other thing I did want to just mention is here with the Taz, where he explains the difference between the milk and the case in the Shulchan Aruch. That he explains it as a difference between like Salu and Av, like I think like meaning invisible and I'm trying to think of the right word, but I think the important thing, right, is that the milk gets absorbed into the chaticha. You can't really do natila on the milk. It just is immediately, it disappears, right? And it's within it. And in the case in the Shulchan Aruch, we're talking about something that falls that you can't do natila. So it's a pretty simple answer, but just wanted to add that.
Show me that Taz. Show me that.
Here, Taz here, right here in 92, where he's asking about. Here, let's just go through it.
And Isur Salul versus Isur Av, right? Where it's looks to be his right. Essentially, I think what he means is like very liquidy versus kind of more fatty and less liquidy, right?
Yeah, but I think. I wasn't sure if the like significant thing really is whether you can't see it anymore, like it's so liquidy it like just went into the chaticha, or whether it's also that whether you assume it's already spread out, it's like fully through that chaticha, like there's no issue anymore of being able to do natila because it's fully out there, or if it's like no, in theory you could do natila, but I wouldn't know where the borders of it are because I can't see it anymore. I can't find it.
Well, first of all, I think this answer is a weak answer of the Rashal, but of the Marshal. But what is the kasha? He says that the kasha,
yeah.
He says the two simanim contradict each other.
Right. So this is the siman. This is 92 again. This is the siman on the case of the milk dropping. So it's the same contradiction that we saw going back to the Mishnah, to the cases themselves, where the Mishnah in Chulin 108 versus the Shulchan Aruch, that one is the milk drops on the piece of the chaticha, and the question is whether this entire chaticha is asur, and we're doing batal b'shishim on this entire chaticha, versus a piece of isur falls on a chaticha that's in isolation, we're going to just do natila. And
in other words, when we're talking about milk falling on meat, I understand what you're saying. When we're talking about milk falling on meat, we say the whole isur, the whole thing is us. We don't say natila, and yet here we're saying you take natila when an isur falls on meat. So why don't we say the same thing by milk and meat?
The other possibility is that it is a milk and meat thing, and it's a chanan thing, and there's in this case, which is also why the stirring of a pot is important in this case. In the case of the milk and meat, you have to stir the pot right away because you have chanan. So if you don't stir right away,
I do feel like the talul and av thing makes sense, especially though if we are comparing like the tipat chalav versus like the chalev, right? That like the tipat chalav is like liquid. Like we talk often about in different cases about milk as like the talul milk, like as talul being used to describe just like liquidy milk. Which in that case, like that, yeah, it's like mitzvah shit. It's like it's going to disperse throughout the
Yeah,
chatikah.
but
Where like
but
when you
how
have
much
like
is
a
it?
more kind of like,
I
as in,
mean,
I think
one
the
little
difference,
drop of milk is
I
going to
don't
pachet in
know
a
the
large
exact
piece.
physics to describe to you to what extent that like one drop of milk is going to actually reach every end of the chatikah, but I do believe it's going to be more thoroughly absorbed than like a chunk of fat that falls onto something. Like that makes sense to me when it comes to the way physical.
Right. I mean, I'm more interested in the kasha.
So
I'm more.
like that. The versus that's so I think that's like reasonable.
I'm happy to
Yeah.
leave it as a. I'm happy to leave it as a difference, as an interesting chiluk between of dinim, and not necessarily knowing why yet, at least.
Yeah, but I think on that note, that does bring us into the topic of fat and its role, which I didn't really touch on because that is the next section, and I so didn't want to get into that. But I think that's a good transition into the next presenter.
Well, thank you very much, Tikvah. You enlightened me very much. I'm sure you enlighten the other students.
Tikvah, yeshkeach.
Very interesting, especially the discussion of Tosfos and Rashi. Anyway, thank you. So we'll take a break, and I forget who's up next, but
I think I'm up next.
Yavni, I think.
So.
Well, let's take a break, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. Recording. Okay, so Yavni, bevakasha.
Thank you. Okay, we're looking at Sifim Hey and Vav now, and mostly Hey. And I'm going to start looking at the same Gemara as Tikvah started with, but going forward a little bit on it, and then work through a couple of Rishonim into the Shulchan Aruch, read the Shulchan Aruch, which should explain the bulk of it, which should like set us up for the bulk of it. And then there's one line in the Shulchan Aruch that we're going to take a closer look at, in particular, objections to it and where it's coming from and what people do with it.
You want to share your screen?
What's that?
You want to share something?
Yeah, I'm sharing screen now. Yes, can people see?
Great.
Thanks. So this is that Gemara. Up to here is where, and you can see my mouse too, right?
Yeah.
Up to here is where Tikvah did, and we're going to go up to here to get an extra concept. Does someone, maybe Tikvah, do you yourself want to read it?
Sure. Where do you want me to start?
You can start here. We've already seen this, so just go through it, and then like this is the part that we're adding.
Okay. Sorry. המשמע לא שנו אלא שניבש בה, אבל נצלה בה כל ואוכל עד שמגיע לגיב. הנה והאומר רב הונא, גדי שתלו בחבו, אסור לאכול אפילו מראש עצמו. Right, so that's what we saw, that if it's cooked, that the mission applies when it's cooked, but when it's roasted, you can peel it back to the skin. And he says, is that really true? Because we have this Rav Huna saying that when it's roasted, you can't eat it even from the tip of the ear. Shanich chalev de mefafe ube chalev asur. So fat is different because it spreads out. But do you want me to start?
No.
ואומר רבא בר חנא עובדה הווה כמי דרב יוחנן וכנישתא דמעון בגדי שצלו בחבו ועטו ושלווה לרבי יוחנן ואומר קולף ואוכל עד שמגיע לחבו. So now we have this case where you're roasting a kid, and they bring it to Rabbi Yochanan. He says that you can just peel it back and eat until you reach the fat.
Which is a problem for resolution, because we said that the distinction was that it's chelev versus gedi, and now we have a case where it's chelev and we're still eating until the.
Can I make a quick just punctuation thing here? I think it's right. Shani chelev de mefafea uva chelev asur v'hamar rabba barbar. Right. That's the.
Oh, yeah.
Uvechelev asur, would you add a
question? Yeah, question, interrobang, whatever we call that thing.
Great,
But,
yeah. Thank you.
Kachushu. So he's saying, but it's in this case, it's lenient. And so it's not lenient, it's lean. Right? So the difference is that in a case of lean fat, it would not spread out. And so you could just peel it back.
Perfect, thanks. So the two concepts that we're using for making distinctions are like that it's chelev mefafeh, and then but there's this category of kachush chelev, which isn't mefafeh. Okay, and so now these are the Rambam and the Bedek Habayit on the Torah Habayit, the Re'eh, and the Rashba are three opinions, like a sampling of opinions that are brought by the Beit Yosef on this topic, which I thought were instructive. The Rambam actually brought his own language, and the Rashba, I believe, the Beit Yosef is just quoting him. The Re'eh is I think a paraphrase from the Beit Yosef. Would someone like to volunteer to read it? I'm setting it up so I can see everyone. Anyone? Maybe Isaac, are you there?
I am. Sorry, the Ra'ah?
The start from the Rambam.
Oh, start from Rambam, my bad. גידי שתלו בחלבו אסור לאכול, אפילו מקצה אוזנו, שהחלב נבלע באיבריו, והוא משביחו ונותן בו טעם. לפיכך, אם היה כחוש ולא היה בו חלב כליות, ולא חלב קרב, אלא מעט כאחד מ-60, קולף ואוכל עד שמגיע לחלב. Okay, so you have a goat that's roasted with the halib still in it. It's also to eat it, even like the very tip of its nose. So like, it doesn't matter, no matter how far you are from the fat or whatever, like you still can't eat any part of it. Because the halib is absorbed into the limbs and it makes it taste better or it improves the goat and it imparts flavor. Therefore, if it was like a very lean kid, like without much fat, and there's no halib in it. Oh, sorry. And there's no.
Right. Those are just the
no halib of the kidneys and no halib of the carav is the guts or the.
Yeah.
Okay. Except like there's so little of it that you have a 1:60 ratio. Then you can scrape it off and eat until you get to the fat. So that's basically taking that Gemara and applying the teruts of like why Rabbi Yochanan allowed it in that one circumstance to why he also says you can like scrape off until you get to the gid.
Great. Perfect. Amazing. What I think is interesting about this is that I feel like I'm noticing a pattern in looking at these sources that the Rambam likes to like collapse concepts, and then other Rishonim are often less comfortable with that. So in this Gemara, it brings up this concept of kachush, and other Rishonim keep that as like a concept about like the type of fat and other things, which we'll see in a moment. But the Rambam says like, oh, kachush, this is an issue of how much there is. It's the same thing as our batal b'shishim question. So he's collapsed these ideas of kachush and echad b'shishim, and yeah, great. Any questions, or can we go into?
Yeah. So which is the lead idea?
Which is the lead idea? I think for the Rambam, the basic idea we have is that things are batel and shishim, and therefore he's gonna take this discussion where this concept of lean meat comes up and map that onto it.
So kachush facilitates the major lead idea of shishi.
Yeah, for the Rambam.
I think you're right. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah. Yavni, I have also a question for you. Is the Rambam more Mekel or more Machmir than the Gemara?
I think he's being more Mekil than the way others will, than the pshat and the way others will.
Why? Why? In what way is he being more Mekel?
He's being more Mekil in the sense that, well, we'll see that the other interpretation, I think in comparison to the other interpretations, I think.
Go up, scroll up. Let me look at the Gemara again for a second.
He's being more Mekil because we already know that there's a batel b'shishim. Is he being more Mekil? I think you could probably look at it both ways.
All right. Well,
he's potentially being more machmir because by the conclusion of the Gemara, you get the sense in a lean piece of meat, you just need to do klipa. You just have to have a klipa, and then you're good to go.
Right.
But the Rambam seems to first have a requirement of shishim, and
Right.
then you have to do a klipa, which might be a machmir step.
No, well, I think in the Gemara also it's
I think he's just using the shishim to be his definition of klush, right? And then, like, you could say that that's more machmir than maybe what people consider the pshat of the Gemara, but I think he's just like seeing, like, what does it mean by klush? Oh, well, it means that it has like this ratio of fat.
I do wonder though if the Rambam is making the claim that essentially, and the Tosafot, by the way, says the same thing, that essentially it has to be batel, right? That it's just there's so little chelev that it's 1 in 60 in this whole thing. So even if it is mifafeh, it doesn't matter. And that's the kachush issue. Not that it's not mifafeh, it's just when it is mifafeh, it's batel at that point.
Right. You get this. I get the sense from the Gemara that when it says it's usher from its head to tail because of fat, that's because we're assuming that of course there's one. The whole case is that there's 160, and we're saying it's usher, and then we say but if it's kachush, then even if it's 1 in 60, you could eat it until you just right if it's kachush. But the Rambam says no. It's not. It's a different case. It's not that it's also talking about whether it's 1 in 60. Because the first part was for sure 1 in 60. That's why it said it's all usher. Because if it would have been a tiny amount, it wouldn't have been all usher. It was obviously 1 in 60. It was obviously, it was obviously not one. It was obviously more than a 60th fat. Otherwise, the whole thing would have been usher. And then when they come and say, and the Gemara comes and says, but I can be lenient even in that case if it's kachush. The Rambam says, no, it's not even in that case. It's a different case. It's where there isn't 60. So I think the Rambam is being more machmir.
It might be a really good reading of the Gemara, though, because if we continue, we'll get another case with Rabbi Yochanan where he has a kfela arma tasted, right? Which sounds like a case of this is a case of does it give tam, and so that would be a 1 in 60 case potentially.
I don't know if that's a different case, but okay, fine.
It is a different case. That's the question. Is it a different case or is it a continuation, really? That's So
yeah, I agree. I think this question of machmir or mekil will be problematized by the next source. So, Isaac, do you feel like continuing?
Okay. Ein cheled mefafea mitbatel bitzli leolam. דקטרה הוא המתבטל מפני שהרוטב מוליך האיסור בשווה, אבל בצלי שהוא מפפע מעצמו, אפשר שהרבה ממנו מתכנס במקום אחד, הלקח אפילו בשישים לא בטל. Okay, so chalev that spreads out throughout the rest of the meat is never batel when meat is roasted, because the pot, when you're simmering something or cooking it in a pot is what batels the chalev, because the rotev like spreads out the iser, but so that it's like evenly distributed. But when it's roasted, because it like bubbles up and around from like its original like the so the fat is in one place, right? And then it bubbles up from there and spreads out. It's possible that in one place there's going to be like more fat than in the other places. Like it's not going to be evenly distributed, because like if you have fat that's around the kidneys, that's not going to be evenly distributed to like, you know, the legs of the animal. Therefore, even if you have a 1:60 ratio, I think he means like overall, it's not batel, because in a particular place, you may not have a 1:60 ratio.
Great, thanks. And so I thought this was interesting because it's taking something like what Lexi was saying about the mefafeh being something that's not spreading out as smoothly as the liquid. In this case, we're talking about like being mevashel, like a lot of what Tikvah was saying is like that it gets mixed up, and in tzali, it's not getting mixed up as well. But we still say that if it's mefafeh, it does get mixed in, and therefore it can be osel the whole thing. But what the re'er feels is that it's spreading out, but not in a reliable way. So we don't know what's happening, how it's spreading out, and therefore it has the risk of everything being usher, but it can't get battled in everything because it doesn't reliably spread out everywhere. It might spread out unevenly, and therefore we might risk taking a piece that ended up with a lot of accumulated chelev there. Questions on this? So then after this, the Beit Yosef then says, okay, there's that machmir opinion, but everyone else, but like lots of other people don't hold this way. And he brings the Rashba twice from two different quotations of the Rashba to express what he feels is the right way to hold. And this is the quote that he described as katzar v'tzach from the Torah Tabayit hakatzar. Isaac, do you want to read it?
Yeah. Hachelev v'hashuman mefafin, ולכן אפילו על ידי צלי, אפילו על ידי מליחה, אוסרים את הכל, עד שיהא בהתר 60 כנגד כל האיסור. ולפיכך גידי שמן, שצללו בחלבו, אם אין בכל הגידי 60 כנגד כל החלב שבו, אסור לאכול. Afilu merosh ozno shehachalev mefafeh. Okay, I'll translate that and I'll go to the next one. So forbidden fat and permissible fat both like bubble up and spread around. And therefore, regardless of whether or not, even if you roast it or even if you salt it, like the meat, they forbid the entire animal. Until you have a 1:60 ratio of heter to the iser. Therefore, a goat where the shemen is roasted in the chalev, if
it means a fatty goat,
Oh, I see. Okay, if you have a fatty goat that's roasted with the chalev, okay, so the opposite of the kahush goat. If you don't have a 1:60 of the chalev to the rest of the meat, it's forbidden to eat it, even the tip of the nose, because that chalev is going to bubble up and go all throughout the animal. Right. Okay.
And to the point here, the ad sheyeh beheter shisim keneged kol ha'isur, that's where the re'er disagrees. Now go ahead.
הכל, במאי דברים אמורים, בגדי שמן, אבל בחחוש, אף על פי שאין בגדי 60 כנגד כל החלב שבו, אינו אסור, אלא כדי קליפה שהחלב של בהמה כחושה, כחוש הוא בטבעו, ואינו מפתח. ויש אומרים שצריך נטילת מקום, והראשון, pardon?
נראה לי, עיקר, אלא שיש לחוש לדברי המחמירים באיסורים של תורה. Okay, so when we say the entire thing, what do we mean? Or what circumstances are we talking about? We're talking about a fatty goat, but in the case of a lean goat, even if you don't have a 1:60 of Isur to Heter, it's not Asur, except you have to like do this little scraping off of the Chalev, because like the nature of like lean fat or lean animal is that the fat does not bubble up and spread around. And there are those who say that you have to take like a thumb's breadth from the place. And it seems to me like the first opinion where it's mutar if it's lean is... The first opinion being that it's klipa as opposed to netila.
Okay. So it seems like that's like the correct thing to say. And you should be like...
But it's good to be cautious and be like the machmirim, i.e. that to take a whole like finger's breadth as opposed to just a klipa, whatever that is, like a minimal surface around the chelev kachush, because this is an isur Torah, so we should be machmir. Great, and so this, thank you, Isaac, that was fantastic. And so this part is where we're differentiating from the Rambam in saying that chusha is not just a question of the quantity, because he says even if this lean fat is more than 1/60 of the gdi that you're roasting, lean fat is not about the quantity, it's about some qualitative nature of the fat, which means the fat doesn't spread out in the meat. Questions about this?
I have a question. In what way is the Ra'ah similar to this second piece of the Rashba?
Does anyone have thoughts? Okay.
This is your Mifchan Sof semester. There is a similarity between.
In that there's in that fat has the potential to have like a local effect.
Exactly. And what does and exactly they agree in here that some fats, here he's talking about, all fat really. But here the in the second piece of I'm sorry, the Ra is talking about all fat, but the second part of the Rashba is talking about just special lean fat. But either way, they both agree, but both of them agree that those cases it has a limited effect. And what does the Ra do with it? That's opposite of what the Rashba does with it.
Makes it chumra.
Right. The Ra says since it has a limited effect, I don't know how limited it is. So maybe it reaches this part and not that part. So the whole thing is usher. And the Rashba says since it's limited, I can be more makel. Right. And I can say eat up until until you hit it. He sort of knows how limited it is. So eat up until you hit it. Right. And I think that the Rashba's reading is much closer to the Gemara than either the Ra or the Rambam.
I agree. And I think
so. What do you do with the expression in the Ra about Sli is mefafea me'atzma?
That goes back to Oh, that's talking about the fact that we're distinguishing here between Tseli and Bishul, where Bishul, like, we have this assumption that things are getting mixed together when we're doing active Bishul, whereas with an active Tseli, we have this statement that in general things stay where they are, and therefore we can eat parts of it that are not being contaminated. But when we have chelev, then chelev, even in Tseli, acts more like bishul and gets mixed in because it spreads out.
The term mefafeh me'asmo seems to me, yeah, I'm agreeing with what you're saying. Mefafeh, but I would say mefafeh me'asmo sounds very, it's like inevitable. It doesn't even need almost anything that you do. You do the slightest amount. That's why I usually translate mefafeh as flies or floats. It just goes. While other cases of spreading, maybe there's more of an effort that sometimes has to be done. But once you have mefafeh me'asmo, there's no way, there's no stopping it. So that's why the rest is after sharbei mimenu meet kanes. Oh, well, no, it goes against what I said.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was wondering, Rav, Yavni, if mifafeh me'atzmo there actually is like in unpredictable ways it spreads. Like we don't really know. Like when I have a soup, I know that the whole, like the flavor goes throughout the entire thing pretty evenly. Right. And here it's like some internal process of spreading that I can't see, and therefore I don't know.
Okay, because then the rest of the sentence would work then. In other words, unequal distribution. The fact that it's more spontaneous,
autonomous,
live, it goes on its own. You don't know actually what the distribution is going to be. Right. Therefore, Hilchos Afil B'Sichum
I think how the Ra'ah and the Rashba, like Dafka, really disagree is that it feels like the Rashba is being like, when it's kachush, it's like man is just like not mifafeh, like it's just going to like stay in a certain space, which is why you can do like kedei klipa or like kedei nektila. Whereas like the Ra'ah is like when it's mifafeh ma'atzmo, it's like Joel was saying, it's that like it's spreads, but I can't trust that it spreads evenly, which is why I can't say that it's batel, and also why I can't just do klipa or kedei nektila. Whereas with the Rashba's imagination of this, it just doesn't really spread at all, which is why I can just like chop off a little.
Good.
Do we have a statement of the Ra'ah regarding lean versus not lean fat? Does he distinguish between them?
Versus, good question. I didn't.
Right, we didn't see anything like that. Perhaps he holds that same thing by all fat.
Right. Right. Although, yeah, then he would have to deal with the Gemara. So.
Right. According to the Rambam, the Gemara seems to say that there's two different things, but the Rambam wasn't bothered by that.
Oh, did you ask about the Rambam or the Re'eh?
No, I was asking about the Ra'ah. How is he ikvot the Rambam, and that he doesn't see a distinction between different kinds of fats, or is he following more closely to the way we would read the Gemara? I don't know. That's a question for further thought or research.
Yeah. Good. All right. Shall I move on to the Shulchan Aruch?
Yes.
Anyone want to volunteer, or should I quickly choose someone?
I can read.
Oh, great.
ומה הדברים אמורים? שאין הצלי אוסר אלא כדי נטילה. בירך עם גידו וכיוצא בו דבר כחוש שאין בו כוח לפעפע בכל החתיכה. Should I translate?
Yes, please.
So what are we talking about? That the tzli forbids only in the case of netila.
No, only the amount of netila.
Yeah, okay.
Which was an earlier statement, and now we're clarifying when that applies. An earlier statement in the Shulchan Aruch, now we're clarifying when that applies.
When the shoulder is with his gid, and in similar cases, when it's kachush, when it's lean, that it doesn't have any strength to spread inequally all over the place in the Chaticha, in the piece.
Right, which I think is the answer that Rav Nachum gave to Tikvah's problem with the Shulchan Aruch, where it says, "Eino oser ela kedei netila." Am I correct?
In other words, no, I don't know what you mean.
I think that's the
That
answer
would be
you were giving
the
the external
basic-
information to why the Shulchan Aruch can make this.
Right, exactly. Yes, because here he's implying, he's saying, now I answer what you're saying. He's saying here that it's only when it's kachush, really it's the next line. Aval gadi shamen,
Right.
that's the difference. That's the difference between the two Gemaras, right?
אבל גדי שמן שצלעו בחלבו, אם אין בכל הגדי 60 כנגד כל החלב שבו, אסור לאכול אפילו מראש אוזנו, שכיוון שהוא שמן מפעפע בכולו. Okay, and so this is again what the Rashba said, isn't it? That if it's a fat gdi and that you are tziling, I don't know, that you're roasting in his own chelev, if he doesn't have in itself 60 times more than the chelev he has inside, then it's forbidden to eat because it spreads all over the place inside the gdi. Because he's fat or he's shaman, he's full of it. אבל אם הוא כחוש, אף על פי שאין בו 60 כנגד כל החלב שבו, אינו אוסר אלא כדי נטילה, שהחלב של בהמה כחושה, כחוש הוא בטבעו ואינו מפעפע. But if it's a lean one, even though it doesn't have 60 times more than the chalev it has inside, it's only forbidden, as we said before, כדי נטילה, שהחלב של בהמה, because the chalev of a behema that is kechusha, that is lean, is also lean in itself, in its nature, and
I want to translate that second kachush as a play on words, and it's almost like chalash.
Okay.
I think that's the way I would translate it. In other words, that lean fat, which is kind of an oxymoron, but lean fat is weak in its nature.
Yeah, it's weak in its nature, and therefore doesn't have the strength as it is weak to spread all over the body of the behema. ואפילו חתיכת האיסור כחושה וחתיכת היתר שנצלית עמה שמנה, האיסור מפעפע בכולה. Okay. So one piece of a forbidden that is weak, that is a lean, and one piece of allowed that you roast together, if with one that is fat, the forbidden chelev spreads all over.
So what it's saying is, even if you have two pieces, now we're talking about two pieces of meat. One is asur meat, that is, and that piece is lean, and a chatichat heter, and a permitted piece of meat, which is fat, which is roasted along, like, with it, then the isur will spread out in everything. And so this is the one that raises lots. Sorry, Rav Nachum, you're muted.
What's the Hebrew term for this that we don't have here? What would you call that?
What would I call this?
There's a Hebrew term that they use for what's going on here, this process that's going on here.
I'm not sure.
You're sure what I mean? What I meant is mifatem.
Oh yeah, so right, we'll see that. That it's getting that it's.
In other words, what we're seeing here is this transition. You can go from being kachush, even though you're kachush, now we're getting even finer grain differentiations. Not only is there kachush and there's this weak fat and there's strong fat, but weak fat can hitch a tramp, can get a hitchhike ride on kosher fat.
Right. So I think that's a very good interpretation of this line. I think there are lots of questions about this line that come up at lots of levels. But yeah, I think that's a good way of understanding what's happening, why this would be said. And so this is the line. Great. So this is the line that's problematic, and we'll come to the discussion of it. Go ahead, Andre. Do you want to?
וכל דבר שיש לו פיפוע שנפל למקום ידוע מהחתיכה בצלי, אף על פי שיש בחתיכה 60 לבטל האיסור, צריך נטילת מקום. So now we are like making a generalization. Everything that has the strength of a pipua, of a spreading, and falls in a known place of a piece of meat, in a roasting thing, then even though the piece is 60 times bigger than the isur, you still need netilat to scrape that part from the piece of meat.
Right.
Should I continue?
Yeah.
Good. וכל מבושל בלא רוטף, או אפוי, דינו כצלי בכל דבר.
Just clarifying that that what we mean by tzale is the point is, as Tikvah was talking about, that it doesn't have, that there's no rotev. That's what we mean by tzale.
Okay. ויש אומרים דאין אנו בקיאים איזה מקרה כחוש או שמן, ויש לאסור בכל עניין הדאיקה 60. So he say, unfortunately, right now we are not experts anymore into knowing which cases are considered lean or fat, and therefore we always have to have against the 60 times.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I wanted to go back and say that so far this has all been very much like the take of the Rashba, and this part, which I didn't bring in earlier, Rishonim, is an interesting point, that even if that if we have that, it's sort of taking a little bit of the concept of the Ra'ah in saying that we have to be careful of this mefafeh stuff, but it's saying that it's not unpredictably spreading out. It might be unevenly spreading out, but it's not unpredictably spreading out. And therefore, even if it's batel b'shishim, we still have to take away from where we know that it originated. So it's, yeah. Is that clear? Any questions on that? And then this, I think, is interesting in the so we've rejected the Rambam's conceptual framework that kachush is just a question of quantity and batel b'shishim, but it ends up sort of getting revived by the Rama in saying that in principle we have this distinction between kachush and shamen, but in practice we don't really know how to make that distinction and looking at a piece of meat, and therefore we treat everything as fat, and therefore the only question that you really have is it 1 in 60 or not?
So the implication there is that it's a difference in quantity. It's not just it's a difference in quality. It's not just a different in quantity. And in terms of the fat, like how to evaluate whether this fat is kechush or not is a matter, and that's sort of is similar to the third source above that was saying like this is just the nature of kechush. Like it's a different quality of fat. It's not just a different amount of fat.
Sorry, the question was how are we?
Yeah, like the fact that we like, how is it possible that we're not able to determine this? If it was just like, well, you just see like it's just not a lot of fat on the bones, that means it's a lean piece of meat. But is it saying that there's actually some kind of quality difference in the fat and we are no longer really able to tell?
Right. I didn't quite understand. Yes, I think you're understanding it correctly, that this is that the Shulchan Aruch and the Rama are acting within the framework that there is that there's this type of fat that's kachush, it's bitivo, and it's not mefafea, and that's like the Rashba, and unlike the Rambam that's saying it's just a question of quantity. But what we end up getting from the Rama is that even like, or maybe because that's the case, that it's a qualitative difference. It's a qualitative difference that we've lost expertise in. And therefore it's very nice for the conceptual discussion of the Gemara and understanding how there are these different cases in the Gemara that look like they're very different rulings. It's giving us a chiluk, like it's not useful for us in our day-to-day halachic decisions. Like it doesn't apply. We can't use it. And therefore we still have to treat it machmirli, and then we're left with 1 in 60 is the only distinction to make.
Now the halacha, according to the Ramah, the halacha comes out like which Rishon that we saw.
It comes out practically more like the Rambam.
Right? Isn't that humorous? In other words, we've come now back, even though we're learning the Gemara like the Rashba, we come with the halacha ends up being like the Ramah, like the Rambam, because we're basically saying it's all
close, but
fat.
not identical. It's close, but not identical.
Thanks, no, I'm doing it.
Because the Ramah still requires a nitilah. At that point, when a simple reading of the Rambam would only require a klipa, though I don't know where I read this, but somewhere I read that the Kesef Mishnah on Rambam says that when he doesn't really even need a klipa. So situationally, whether you need shishim is identical, but then there's a second step where there is a difference between the halacha according to the Ramah and the Rambam.
Right.
Mm-hmm. You're saying whether it's Natila or Klipa, or you're saying whether it's Natila at all?
Or Natila or Klipa, or potentially nothing.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Also, I want to make another comment.
Yeah, I think that's true, because the Klipa emerges time after time to being actually a nothing, but a feel-good gesture.
To be safe.
Well, this Natila, this Natila is a Tilat Makom. In other words, it's not a Klipa, because we have a serious chashash that it's spreading here.
In the Ramah, exactly. I think that's what I'm saying, right? That we still have the concept of that it's spreading, but not.
Also, you should mention this other Ramah here. Kol mevush. This is like a big chiddush here. Kol mevushal below rotiv, above. The first part is very interesting because I'll just say a couple of things about it, and then you can go on. But one thing is, you see here that's mevushal, not like I said, mevushal below rotiv. There's a concept of mevushal below rotiv, which is interesting. Fits back to what we were talking about with Tikvah. How can you mevushal below rotiv? You cook this meat somehow, and there's no rotiv there. It just dries up. All of afui, or you bake it also with no rotev. Baking is assuming with no rotev. You can make baking with a rotev if you cover it, but assumingly, I would add it's also below rotev. Dino could sleep a kol davar. That's considered like roasting, and this will be like could sleep a kol davar, including. In other words, first of all, it means that things don't necessarily transfer, like we're learning here, but also regarding other halachot that you should know about, like. The requirement to roast liver, for example. Here you see, but kol davar, you can roast liver in an oven as long as there's no rotev. And they actually do this. They actually do this in industrial, roasting of liver.
I mean, I think Rav Nachman, part of the thing here is that Bishul has two definitions, right? One is the general category of how you heat food, and the other is a technical definition of food in liquid, right? And the way the Ramah is using it here, I think, is in the overall category.
Yeah, you're right, exactly. Well, basically, you could say it like this: Kol mevushal below rotav eino bishul, eino mevushal, ela salui. In other words, really, that's what he means.
That would clarify it for a lot of people.
and confuse it for the rest of us.
Yeah, for everybody else.
In other words, right, kol mevushal below rotev. Well, that's roasting. That's not really mevushal anymore. That's what he's really saying. Agreed. All right. we're, you know, you have to use the rest of the time, and we're gonna next week gonna do the other 4 people. Gonna have to, sorry to postpone again. Although I kind of planned that also. So continue, Yavni.
Great. Alice, do you want to finish up the Shulchan Aruch?
ודווקא באיסור חלב או שהאיסור דשייר בו שמנונית, אבל באיסור דלא שייר בי שמנונית, והוא בוודאי כחוש, אינו עושה רק כדי נטילה. Okay, so this is all concerning forbidden things that have chelev or that have oiliness, yeah? But concerning the other ones that don't have any oiliness or fattiness, for example, that are kachush, like for example, kachush, they are only forbidden and you do netila. דבר שיש לו פיפוע בצלי, אם היה אחד חם ואחד צונן, התחתון גובר, לפיכך אם נפל חם על צונן אינו אוסר, אלא כדי קליפה, ואם נפל צונן על החם, אם אין בהיתר 60 כנגד האיסור, הכל אסור. Okay, so if a forbidden thing that has spreading power in a roasting thing, if one is warm and the other is cold, we know that the lower part, the lower thing wins, and therefore, if the forbidden thing fell into the cold one, then you only need to do klipa. But if it's the other way around, that it was cold that fell into cham, then everything is forbidden and you need 60 against it if you want to mevatel it.
Right, and this is just what Noam did with us last week, copied over for the case of tzali. So perfect.
And it's probably, and it's not only 60, it's probably 60 plus nitila is my guess.
Okay. Thanks. All right. I am looking at the time and I'm going to skip ahead. Let's see, how should I? Let's look at, so remember we're interested in this line. We're trying to understand it, and let's look at where it comes from quickly in the tool. And then, yeah, so in the tool, it's copied over from the tool where it says, באמת דברים מורים בערך עם גידו וכיוצא בו דבר כחוש שאין בו כוח לפעפע בכל החתיכה, אבל גדי שמן שצלעו בחלבו אסור לאכול אפילו מראש אזנו, שכיוון שהוא שמן מפעפע בכולו, ולא מבאי חתיכה אחת שיש בה חלב שמפעפע לכולה, אלא אפילו חתיכת האיסור כחוש וחתיכת היתר שניצלה עמה שמנה, האיסור מפעפע בכולו. This is just a restatement. It's where the Shulchan Aruch got this language from, and Rabbi Yosef Karo himself was the first to object to this, and he says, "Uma shekatav lo mibai chaticha." I'm here in 13. לא מבאי חתיכה אחת שיש בה חלב שמפעפע בכולה, אלא אפילו חתיכת איסור כחוש וכולי, נראה שטעמו משום שנמחה קצת השומן ונבלע בחתיכות האיסור, חזר השומן ההוא חתיכת נבלה, וכשהוא נבלע אחר כך בחתיכות ההיתר הוא מפעפע. לפי זה, okay, so he says, so he's guessing where this is coming from, and his first theory is that the fat from the heter is absorbing into the, is getting the isur from the isur, and then going back and then becoming chaticha naset nevela, becoming chanan, and then going back into the heter pieces and isuring them all. לפי זה, לדידן דנקטינן כרבינו אפרים, דאין חתיכה עצמה נעשית נבילה, אלא בבשר בחלב, כמו שכתבתי בסימן, etc., שחתיכת היתר כחוש שרה. So he says, and in this case, if that's the reason, then that is only by the opinion that Hanan holds for non-basar b'chalav, and therefore we hold that Hanan doesn't, there's no Hanan here, and therefore this case should be Shale. Aval, Ani mesupak im adin ken, but he's in doubt whether this is actually the right judgment. Share efshar shetamo shel Rabbeinu hu midamar Rav, because there could be a different reason for this. And that comes from a Gemara which has very similar language to this. Amar Rav beperek kitzad solin, da'afilu basar shchuta shamen ubasar nevela kachush, da'azil basar shchuta umefatem לבשר נבלה הכחוש, לבשר נבלה הכחוש, והדר לבשר נבלה ומפתם ברכה לבשר שחוטה, ואם ברכה אנו אומרים כך, כל שכן, so it's bringing another case where things are being also roasted together, and we have exactly the same. We have basar that's been shechted, that's fat, and a basar that's nevela, that's lean. And then, but we say that there's like it gets it like Rav Nachum was saying that the fat allows the I guess I would say like the fragrance of the nevela to infect the shchuta. And then he says, אם ברכה אנו אומרים כך, כל שכן שייך לכך בצלי, ועוד אכתוב בזה, so, and if this is the case for this fragrance, then it should be even more the case for tzeli. It's a little confusing because both cases are talking about tzeli, but I think it's talking about like where they're roasting together and the air is what's transferring, but and then in our case, like they're actually touching, and then there should be an even stronger transfer.
Why is this not Hanan? So this is an Isser based not on Hanan.
Right. So it's a good question, and this is an Isser based on Hanan. He's saying it's an Isser based on this other concept of Reche, what comes up in this.
Well, I would say pitum. You know, I wouldn't. He gets it from the case of reiche, but the concept is really pitum, which is like I would translate it as like fattening up, because they say pitum avazim, like fattening geese or something.
Right. Right. So it's something. I guess you would have to say that it's something similar to Hanan, but that's like a special property of fat. That is.
But I don't think it's Hanan. Now that's what I was trying to say before. I don't think it's Hanan. What it is it's like the fat permeates the other food and then becomes a conduit, becomes a conveyor belt to allow the original Isser, not the fat that goes in and out, but it becomes a conveyor belt to let the original Isser travel further. And therefore it's not Hanan, because the original Isser is now getting into, even though it normally doesn't have the ability, it's like giving somebody, you know, a plane or a train that he can travel now to a place that he couldn't have reached before.
Right.
But it's not Hanan in the sense that it's not that the fat is going in and out and the fat became usser. It's that the fat is just is like a conveyor belt, bringing to new places the isser.
So I'm out of time. I'll just say that there's another objection from later in the Beit Yosef, in the tool that the Beit Yosef brings, and similarly, and then the Taz. But so even though the Beit Yosef objects in a couple of different ways to this idea, he still brings it in the Shulchan Aruch as the ruling. And the seemingly contradictory ones. The Darchei Moshe, I think, has a nice defense of this, which is along the lines of what Rav Nachum is saying. But the Taz apparently knocks down all the ideas. I had questions about some of his reasoning, but knocks this down, and in the end says, אלא ודאי דבר זהו אין לו יסוד ועיקר כלל מבלי עיון אמרו כן. And this thing clearly has no basis or truth to it, and it was stated and it was said without any serious thought. And then he has nice language. He says, "V'ilulei de mistefina lahagia haiti," and then so that's on the Shulchan Aruch. He says this, and then "V'ilulei de mistefina lahagia haita magia b'divrei hatur b'lashon zeh." And if I weren't so concerned about making corrections to the language of the tool, I would suggest the following correction. If I were so bold as to say that there's a mistake and this should be the real language of it, this is what I would say. Ela afilu chatichat ha'isur shmena v'chatichat eter kachusha v'chule. That he switches it, that the isur has to be the one that's shmena, and even though the heter is kachush, it still spreads out into both pieces. And then he has a reasoning why this makes sense according to all the qualifications. Sorry
that lashon of the Taz makes a lot of, I mean, I'm not suggesting that correction. I don't think that's legitimate, probably, but that obviously
neither is the Taz.
Yeah, but that halacha makes a lot of sense, that the chaticha isur is shamein. So now he himself, it's not a conveyor belt. He himself is traveling into the isur kachush, and even though the isur kachush is not particularly fluid, he can permeate it.
Right.
Did you look up the Chachmas Adam?
So I tried looking for later sources. I didn't find any that, I didn't look everywhere, and I didn't find any that dealt with it. I think probably because in terms of later posting, because it isn't actually that relevant Lamase, because Lamase we aren't making this distinction anyway, right, according to the Lama, and so like it's an exercise, but we're just going to treat it all as
in the end everything is going to be fatty. Excellent. Wow, you guys did a great job, everybody.
It's a good night. Very good night.
Very good night. Enjoyable learning.
Yeah.
Next week, we have 4 people to go, so they're going to have to. I'm not going to give you as much time, those other 4 people, because I want to finish the Siman. So you'll each get about half an hour. I guess. Try to keep it to half an hour next time. But this was great. It was totally wonderful. The truth is, usually the earlier Simanim need more time because that's when you learn the Gemara background in general. Okay, guys, thank you very much. Yisher koach to everybody.
Yisher koach.
Thanks, Adan.
Laila tov.